In Pokémon, every Pokémon has a type. Some have one type, some have two, and the way that these interact with each other is the core mechanic of the game. Knowing type matchups is probably the most basic knowledge a player has. It's the first thing that we learn through our starter Pokémon, and influences most of the rest of the decisions that we have to make. On offense, it's important to have a good mix of moves to try and maximize super effective damage. And on defense, you want to have types that limit your weaknesses. The current type chart has been unchanged since Generation 6, when Fairy was introduced to balance out the all-powerful dragons that had taken over, and Steel lost its resistances to Dark and Ghost on account of it being the undisputable best type. Since this change, nearly a decade ago, I think that the type chart could do with some updates to more effectively balance the types, and I want to give my take on how I would do this. Let's start with some rules for what changes I want to make. I don't want to take or add any new types to the chart. I like the idea of types being more general and covering a number of categories. So Normal also doubles as Sound, Psychic with Space, and Fairy with Light, sort of like subtypes. I also don't think that every type should be equal. The type that represents caterpillars should absolutely be weaker than the type that represents mythical dinosaurs that breathe fire. So not every type has to be the exact same strength, just every type should have utility, and most importantly, something that sets them apart from others. Finally, I want to try and stay on brand with each of the types, no having random changes just for balance. With these rules in place, I want to start off with what is undoubtedly the worst type. Ice types have always been given the cold shoulder by Game Freak. Apart from in Gen 1 when none of the types they were weak to were any good, they've always struggled unless they've been exceptional. The reason why is because Ice is easily the worst defensive type in the game, resisting only their own type and being weak to 4 others. You could argue that Ice is balanced out by having amazing offensive coverage, but most Ice types don't even get to use this amazing offense because they have such a hard time getting on the field. Instead, Ice type moves are used by non-Ice types for coverage, the most obvious being with Ice Beam, one of the best attacks in the game, which is overwhelmingly used by water types as it's such a good move for them. Because of this, I don't want to add any offensive buffs to Ice type, as it would benefit water types way more. Instead, they need a good defensive boost. The first change I would add would be simple, and one that I'm amazed hasn't been added in already. Make Ice resist water. It makes sense, water is just frozen ice, and if you put a little bit of water on a lot of ice, it freezes. It's the same principle that's used to give water a resistance to ice. It's just that in reverse. Gameplay wise, it would be amazing for Ice types. They get a resistance to one of the most common and spammable attacking types in the game, and it gives them another way to get into the field without being two-shot by a neutral move. The second change is very similar, a ghost resistance. It's a little bit of a stretch, but I can imagine that the cold Ice types are resistant to the creatures of the night, as we often see ghosts giving off chills, and Ice types would be unable to get these chills. Ghost is also a great offensive type, with Shadow Ball being a move that can be spammed really easily because of its lack of switch-ins, with only Darks and Normals being able to take it. This change would mean that you'd be able to punish Ghost spam, as it can let in an Ice type, who can use their great offensive typing to cause some damage to your team. Overall, I think that these changes would do great in transforming Ice into a type that can be effective outside the role of Glass Cannon. So many Ice types, like Lapras, Aurorus, and Sir Titan, are built to be tanks, but they've always lacked the typing to do so, so it would allow them to really work better in this role. It would also mean that offensive Ice types now have great opportunities to switch in and cause more damage. Frail Pokemon like Weavile, Jinx, and Cloyster on the special side now having the ability to come in on a switch. Similarly to Ice, Bug is also a weak defensive type, but that can be remedied quite easy. One of the reasons why I can't buff Bug types offensively is U-turn. This would be overpowered if we gave Bug more super effective damage, and it wouldn't help Bug types as much as it would any other type, so I'm going to leave it as is. Defensively, I think Bug should resist Fairy. They're both little guys, and Bugs are the most monstrous of the two. Plus I like the idea that Fairy types are all cute and kind, so they literally wouldn't hurt a fly. Fairy, like Ghost and Water, is really spammable, so I think it would give a lot of defensive utility to Bug, which previously lacked any, and it would turn Pokemon like Scizor into anti-Fairy machines. On the other end of the spectrum, we have Steel. Steel is probably the best type in the game. It has 10 resistances and 1 immunity, and it's almost mandatory on any team because of its great defensive utility. I think Steel should have another weakness to balance it out, and Electric is my choice. It makes sense as Steel conducts electricity and Water is weak to Electric for the exact same reason. It's also a good pick balance-wise, as it means that Steels now have something else to worry about on the special side, and makes it so that some of the best Steels, like Heatran and Corviknight, who both are immune to one of their typical weaknesses, have another way to be checked. But I think that this might also cause a ripple, as I think Electric might become too good of an attacking type. Because of this, I'm going to give Rock a resistance to Electric. Rock is often caught between two types. It tries to be a great offensive type, but doesn't have the foolproof strategy of just clicking Earthquake. And it tries to be a good defensive type, but it has nowhere near the defensive ability of Steel. It's a type that struggles for identity between the two of them. Because of this, I think it's a type that needs some changes, and giving it an Electric resistance would really give it a niche, as few types do well against this type. I also want to remove Rock's weakness to Ground, as many Rock types are built around strong physical bulk, but they have weaknesses to moves like Close Combat and Earthquake. So by doing this, I want to relieve some of the pressure and threat that they get from physical attackers that they are meant to wall. Overall, I think that these changes would be good for the metagame. I've buffed a few weak types like Ice, Bug and Rock, and weakened some of the strongest types like Fairy, Steel, Water and Ghost. I think these changes will make the game a bit more tactical and a bit slower, as the more resistances added will make more coverage be needed by Pokemon. In the future, I may consider different changes to the type chart, but I plan on showcasing other changes I would make to the game first.